Hi, my name is Ryan, and our presentation is going to be about prison reform laws and their effects in California.
Hey guys, I'm Anish.
Hi, my name is Cayman.
And I'm Jessica.
So when we started our project, we had to do some research on mass incarceration, and we found out how much of a problem it was in the United States. After doing our initial research, it became clear that the goals of the prison system, which are to protect the public and deter crime, weren't being achieved, which made us want to look more into incarceration as a whole. And there have been studies that have found the connection between increased prison rates and lower crime to be tenuous and small. Before we can really get into our data and analysis, though, we need to provide some context on the difference between jails and prisons because I didn't know, and I feel like most people probably don't know the exact difference. Jails are local and prisons are state or federal. Prisons hold convicted offenders that serve longer sentences, while jails hold people awaiting trial, sentencing, and also people with shorter sentences to serve. People who have been found guilty of breaking a state law are usually sent to state prison, and the same is done with federal laws in federal prison.
So that being our topic, our question of interest is how many laws since the 1980s affected incarceration rates in California, and where have those changes been most present? In order to answer this question, we decided to look at laws from the 1980s to present. We had a particular focus in California, and we're trying to gauge the effect both in jail and prisons. Furthermore, we're trying to see if there's a difference in the effects between demographics.
So we got our data set from the Vera Institute of Justice. The jail data comes from a combination of the Census of Jails and Annual Survey of Jails. The prison data comes from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. A few limitations of the data set. The first is that we had no data regarding the type of crimes that anyone committed. The data was purely populations. It wasn't going to the individual, so there was no crime data. And the jail data specifically was compiled from multiple censuses, which meant that there were just some inaccuracies when compiling that data together. And the ambiguous values in the jail columns will be expanded on a little bit later in the presentation.
So as you can see here, this is a picture of a raw data set. And a lot of the different variables were like year, state, county name. And for the year, the data would start from 1970 and go all the way up to 2018. And then for state, obviously it had data on every single state. And then for each state, it would have the different counties. And we also had variables regarding the population. So we can see here total population of age 15 to 64. And they would also split the population by gender. But what we were most interested in was the race. And we could see race for the Asian Pacific Islander group, Black, Latinx, white, and natives. And in order to clean this data, we were only focused on California laws. So we only kept the states in California. And we also only used data from 1985 to 2018 because those were the years where our laws were more focused around. And we also only kept columns that were relevant to our analysis. So before cleaning the data, there was around 122 columns. And in the final data set, as you can see right here, there are only 6 columns. So we definitely made the data a lot smaller. What we also did when cleaning the data was we also split it into 2 smaller data sets. So we had one data set about the jail populations and another data set regarding the prison populations. And for each year, we combined all of the data from each county, and we could have a total population for each year.
Next, we're going to go over the laws that we're focusing on. The first is the AntiDrug Abuse Act of 1986. This is a law that came out in a period of time where the government was taking a really hard stance on drugs. The changes that invoked was the mandatory minimum sentence for drug offenses. So based on what amounts of drugs you were holding, it could trigger a minimum sentence. And this is really important because they had unfair runs between different kinds of drugs. So for example, crack cocaine and powder cocaine had a different weight ratios that trigger this sentence. So it was a 100-to-1 ratio. In the next act, it's the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010. This loosened restrictions from the previous laws. These changes that were made were that it was harder to trigger the mandatory sentences from the previous law. So it changed the ratio from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1. It also imposed harsher fines for drug trafficking, and also they removed the minimum sentence for first-time offenses for crack cocaine. Lastly, we look at Prop 47, which came out in 2014. Again, it was a continuation of efforts to lessen mass incarceration. The change that was particular to this law was that drug-related offenses that were charged as felonies could be changed to misdemeanors. So basically, it didn't have to invoke a prison state. You could serve it through community service or different fines. And so this was for all cases that came out after 2014, cases where the sentences were already being served, and also cases where the sentences had been fully served already. So you could just submit an appeal and it would change the status of your felony.
So this first graph shows the jail population by race. And the first thing I want to point out here is the Anti-Drug Abuse Act that was passed in 1986. We see that there's an increase in all the populations in jails, all the different race populations in jails. But we can't really attribute this increase solely to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, because jail and prison population has just been increasing in general since 1970. But it is interesting that this, this did help or contribute towards the increase in the jail population. And then if we look over to where the Fair Sentencing Act is in 2010, we see that there's a very small decrease, and then it's followed by an increase again. And so we do think that the decrease in 2011's population was due to the Fair Sentencing Act, but it wasn't a very big dip in the jails, because roughly 2/3 of drug offenders are actually in prisons, not jails, which is from prisonpolicy.org. But the increase right after, from 2011 to 2014, when Prop 47 was passed, was most likely due to California's Public Safety Realignment Initiative, which basically was an attempt to reduce overcrowding in prisons by sending people from state prisons to county jails. So that's why there's an increase from 2011 to 2014. And then in 2014, again, we see another big decrease, which we think was due to Prop 47. And you can see that the white and black populations stay pretty low after the Prop 47 decrease, but the Latinx population starts to rise again, and we're not actually sure why this is. So this graph shows the unknown jail population, unknown race. And this was created from the limitation earlier, where I said that there were some ambiguous values in our jail columns, where basically the total jail population didn't add up to the populations of all the races added together. And so we created another column called unknown race, which basically had the total jail population minus the sum of all the jail population races. And you can see here, we just wanted to show this graph to show that there are some inaccuracies in our data, and that basically there's even negative values here. And we think that these inaccuracies are probably due to the varying census data between the census of jails and the annual survey of jails, which the data set was created using.
So this graph shows the prison population by race. And one of the first things you can notice is from 1989 to 1990, there's like this dip in the graph. And this is where our data actually had missing values, which is why there are no values there. And like Keeman was saying earlier, we can see the data from 1983 all the way up to 2000. We can see the population increasing for all of different races. And we can't say that the Anti-Drug Abuse Act caused this increase, but it's very interesting to see this trend. And then after 2000, we can see the Black and white population start to level out. However, the Latinx community continues to increase. And then in 2010, when the Fair Sentencing Act is passed, we can see a decrease in the Black, Latinx, and white populations. And again, when Prop 47 is passed, we can see a very similar decrease.
In conclusion, we see several trends that come along after the laws of interest. So for the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, we see that this contributed to the overall increased trend in both prisons and jails. Again, there's like a lot of different laws that came out in this time, but one of these, this was a national law. So it makes sense that it was strictly followed and that it had such a big effect. The next law, Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, we say that the decrease was mostly reflected in prisons, and also this was likely accumulation of efforts because at the time there was a Supreme Court case that was mandating the California to decrease their population in prisons. So the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 came out separately, but also with this other case. And lastly, Prop 47, we say that was unconcluded in our graph simply because we're missing the data from a couple years after this prop came out, and also the trends in our jail population were very slight and they sort of taper off. So we don't know exactly what kind of effect this had in reality. If we go to the next slide, we see that there is a page called the prison policy that has its own information relating to Prop 47. So we see that this came out in 2014, and there was definitely they saw a decrease in population in jail population numbers. So while we don't have conclusions on our graphs, it was definitely touched upon in other pages that we researched. So moving forward, we would want to have more recent data because, like I said, some of our laws are fairly recent and not all the data sets doesn't reflect that. We would like to have more complete data for Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native populations. They're largely ignored in censuses. So we would want to see how we can get more information on those populations. And lastly, we would want to see more crime-specific data simply because a lot of our laws were drug offense related. So it would be interesting to see if this changed across what kinds of drugs were held. So the follow-up questions that we had is if this is consistent across states. Some of our laws were federal, some of our laws were California focused. So it'd be interesting to have a comparison with other states. And if the results were varying based on crime. Again, we want to see like a further breakdown of the effect based on what offense was committed. Thank you for listening, and special thanks to our mentors, Javier and Alex.